Today I'm going to be talking about this, the new VRX module from Caddx. This is a goggles module allowing you to convert any set of FPV goggles with a HDMI input to be able to work with the Avatar HD system from Walksnail, who is also Caddx. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through what the module is. We're going to tear it down, take a look inside, walk you through its features, and then at the end, after doing some flying, I'm going to share with you my thoughts and tell you if I think you should consider getting this if you're someone who's looking to get into HD. Now, this module is similar in many ways to the HDZero VRX module and is going to allow people to get involved in HD quicker and easier than ever before, because rather than having to go out and spend money on an expensive set of OLED goggles, you can now convert your existing goggles to work with the system. However, there are some things you do also need to be aware of, and we will be covering that in this video as well, including the limitations that many goggles may have when using the module. Anyway, let's get on with this video and let's take a look at what this device is all about. Okay, so let's do a quick unboxing. There's not a lot to see here. You've probably seen it already, but I will go through it. Now, when you get the box and open the lid, you'll get this nice little card inside that has a QR code that takes you to the instructions online, and it gives you an overview of the module as well. Something that the guys over at Walksnail Caddx have been doing really well is these kind of setup guides, and it's nice to see. Now, obviously, in the box, we've got the module itself, which is the VRX module. You can see that there. Similar in shape and size to the old HDZero VRX module, although this one is a little bit taller, but not quite as wide, and we'll compare it in a minute. We then have some sticky pads for mounting it on the front of whatever you want to mount it to. They've included two little antennas. Let me just get one of them out. There are two antennas built into the module already, and then you've got two stubbies that mount onto the top. We've got a dual power cable, as well as a straight-to-straight mini HDMI cable, and they've also given some fixings in here as well. Jumping in a bit closer, we can now see the two patch antennas that are built in on the front nice and clearly, with the fan in here for cooling. We have two RP SMAs on the top. These are the other two antenna ports for use with the stubbies that they include. We have our little joystick, which is our 4-way joystick there, with the 5-way push down in the middle. We've got our bind button, we've got our back, play, stroke, record, whatever that button does. Then on the bottom, we've got HDMI output. On this side here, we've got our SD card, our DC input, which supports 2 to 5S. And then on the back, you can see it's pretty much clear. You've got that flat area for mounting it to your goggles, but you've also got this removable piece up here, which allows you to mount it on a bracket, very similar to what was used with the HDZero module in the past, allowing you to mount it onto the top of your goggles. Now, size and shape-wise, you can see it's very similar to the HDZero module. It is longer and taller, but it's not as deep. So if I pop them up, you can see there that it doesn't stick out as much overall, and it just has a much flatter profile. Now, the Avatar HD module supports pretty much all of the same functionality that you get in the Avatar HD goggles. The only real difference is it doesn't have built-in screens. So, for instance, it supports the normal latency 60 frames a second mode and low latency 100 frames a second mode, which it outputs over the HDMI port. It has the built-in DVR, the OSD support, 1080p and 720p modes, and all of the other features that you get on the goggles. The real big difference is it is a standalone module that allows you to use it with your own goggles rather than you paying out for a set of goggles specifically for the Avatar HD system. Whilst that is going to offer a lot more people the option of getting onto digital, there are a few things you need to be aware of, and specifically the compatibility in low latency mode. As I've said, it outputs the 60 frames a second mode or the 100 frames a second mode. However, at the point of me making this video, there is only one set of goggles on the market that is compatible with that low latency 100 frames a second mode, and that is these, the new HDZero goggles. These will work with the Avatar HD module in both the normal latency and low latency modes. Pretty much Every other goggle, or actually every other goggle that is available on the market today that does have HDMI input though, is limited to the 60 frames a second mode, including the Skyzone 04Xs. That isn't to say you can't use it with these other goggles, but if you want that absolute low latency performance, you're going to want to use it with the HDZeros, because these are the only ones on the market today that are going to give you that 100 frames a second, that 100 hertz functionality. Now, the next thing we're going to do is a quick teardown before we actually get this out and give it a try. Now, getting into this is actually fairly straightforward. There's just 4 screws that go on the back, which hold the 2 parts of the casings together. We then have a 5th screw in the middle, which holds the bracket on in the center as well. And then we've got the SMA nuts at the top. Now, obviously, as this unit has 2 built-in antennas, that means that there are only 2 external ports on the outside. However, that isn't to say you couldn't modify it if you wanted to. It doesn't mean that you couldn't add additional ports if you did want to, instead of using those built-in antennas. Once you've got the screws out, you can then very carefully unclip the module. Now, when you do this, you do need to take care, because if I just flip it up, you'll see that there are wires that cross from the front to the back. That is the wires for the fan. And there is also the antenna wires crossing over there as well, from those patch antennas on the front to the PCB. If I carefully, though, open that up, you can then see the inside of the unit. We got on the front here, our fan right here, and there's this sort of aluminium heat pipe setup. It's not actually a heat pipe. I shouldn't use the word heat pipe. It's an aluminium bracket, or a heat sink of sorts, that runs along to there, with this thermal pad that goes on top of the main SoC. And there's another pad there then that goes on top of the HDMI port just to hold it in place. That won't be for any cooling. We've then got our 2 patch antennas. They are going over to our main PCB into the ports there and there. We then have the SMAs on the top up here coming down to the other 2 ports. The port with the transmission SMA is this one here. You can see that cable coming down to the PCB. And this is the one with the large power amplifier there next to the mixer. We then have our fan connector over here. You can see the port for the USB, that HDMI as I've already mentioned. We've then got another wiring harness that comes up from the top of the board here that goes all the way along, and that goes to our joystick and button board. We've then got our DC input jack that goes onto the main board. And then here you've got a secondary board which is soldered to the main board. This is a voltage regulator from the looks of it. It's called VRX power. It's hard to see exactly what it says because this connector does go over the top of it, but that is sort of sandwiched on top of the main board, covering it in that area there. Looks a bit of an afterthought, or at least it was added as part of this design to keep it off the main board at least. Now, I've removed the joystick off the top of this board. I'm just going to very carefully unplug this wiring harness, which is going in, and I'm going to move that out of the way. And then I'm just going to lift this and just try to withdraw this board. It is being held in place by some clips on either side. So I'm withdrawing this board from underneath because it is held in place with a little bit of glue. This is held with a couple of wires that go down to the main bottom PCB, and then that's covering that voltage regulator area there. We'll take a closer look at that in a moment under the microscope, and then that allows us to actually free up and withdraw this top board here if we wanted to. I don't actually feel the need to do that now. Now, just showing you this under the microscope, if I just start in the top left corner, that's where we've got that SD card slot. And if I move around, here is that area that that board was covering. You can see, rather than there being a voltage regulator on that board, they've moved that off onto a separate PCB, and that's what you can see on this board here. We'll take a closer look at that a bit more in a second when I refocus the camera. If I now just shift that to the side a moment, out of the way, and just move the wiring harness, we can then start looking around the main board. We've got pretty much exactly the same basic setup that we had last time on the goggles. There we have our main chipset, which is masked. We then have our IE2000 transceivers. There's two of them. There's one there, and then there's one there. Let me just move that wiring harness out of the way. Below this, you've then got the amplifiers. So you've got that small receiving amp. We've got the larger PA from Skyworks, which goes to that single RF output, which is that top left port as I'm looking at it here. You've then got another receiving amp and another receiving amp here on the other inputs and outputs. That way, what you have is one antenna which transmits, and from the looks of it, three that only receive, with the transmitting one being the only one which is on the 85743, which is that large power amplifier that we've seen before. Then obviously they go down to our ports. So if we look, we can see that this one here goes down into this one. This one here comes down the side into this one. This one here will come straight down just behind the connector into that one. And then that one there, you can see, goes straight down into there. Just moving around the rest of the board, there will be a bit of a difference in this one that we didn't see in the goggles. And that is most likely that chipset there. I was waiting to find it, and there it is. That is a PS176 HDM. I haven't checked that at the point of recording, but I suspect that's the HDMI transmitter. That is what is going to allow this chipset to communicate via the HDMI port. You wouldn't have had that in the other goggles because it wasn't strictly HDMI. It was actually USB-C output, and that was being converted to HDMI, whereas this is using a proper normal HDMI output, and as a result, it's going to need the chipset to drive that. We've then got some sundry components. We've got a voltage regulator down there from the looks of it. Then if I move up to here, we've got our RAM chips for our main SoC, our USB port on the side for updating the firmware, our fan port, and then our buttons on the top with our main control circuitry. Everything else is pretty basic. We've got our real-time clock in the middle, our speaker for our audible output, and that is pretty much everything. I will do a zoomed out view. Let me just move this so you guys can see that last chipset that I didn't mention there. That one is, let's just have a look. It's probably voltage regulator, if I'm honest. I think it's the dialogue voltage regulator. Yeah, it is. That's the main voltage regulation IC for powering the RAM and the main SoC. Now, just showing you that other board which sits over the top with the voltage regulator on. If we go across, you can see there's a voltage regulation IC there, which looks to be an SCM6132YPS8. I think that is from the looks of it. We've then got a diode. We've got our coil there as well. So that's just a buck converter. And then if we move over, there's just some capacitors with the wires on the output. So what you'll have is ground, V in and V out, and you can see that labeled there, plus 5 volt. We'll have battery in down here, 2 to 6S, and 5 volt output. So that is simply providing 5 volts for the main power system on the unit. Now, just to show you what one of the patch antennas looks like, I've removed it from the housing. You can see it's a stacked PCB design. So what you've got is your coax coming into the back. The back PCB is the driven element, and then you've got another element on the front. There's nothing actually going between them except for the standoffs. So what you'll have is your main element underneath this at the back, and then this director element at the front. Now, just to give you an indication of what this antenna's performance is like, I'm going to put it on my VNA, and I'll put a chart up on screen showing you the final results. Now, just showing you the results on my Arnest VNA that's been calibrated on the frequency band 5550 to 6 gigahertz. Now, we have a center frequency on this of 5750, and if we look at the SWR chart in the bottom right corner here, you can see at its lowest point, which is about 5.777 gigahertz, we're getting about 1.4. That's not particularly bad, it's not particularly great, it certainly isn't anything to worry about. At the highest point here, we're looking at about 2.2, and what's quite interesting is just how flat this SWR curve is, and that is a hint of the overall performance of the antenna. For instance, if we head up to the top left, here we have an S11 chart or a loss chart, and if you see, this is showing us a dB rating of about -7.8. A really good high performing antenna should have a loss of more than 10 dB or -10 dB, I should say, and then antennas with poorer performance will head up towards a loss of 0 dB. So the lower the number, the better the antenna performs, and a good antenna should have a loss of -10 dB or more. This, you can see, is coming out at about -7.8, and that is showing that it isn't the best antenna in the world, certainly isn't the worst, but what it does show is that it's not going to be up there with the likes of something like the True RC XAs, which would have a much lower loss down to -16, -17 dB. Just looking at the chart for the Omni that they include in the pack, you can see here, looking at the loss, we're now down to -9.62, much closer to that -10 dB that I was talking about earlier. So overall, the Omni should perform pretty decent. If we look at the SWR chart, it's not great, but it's certainly not terrible. Overall, I'm not seeing anything shocking here with the antenna results. I'm not going to say they're the best, but I don't think they're particularly bad, but we'll have to see how they actually perform in the real world. Now, just to walk you through how the Avatar HD system looks via the VRX module, I've currently got it connected on HDMI, and you're viewing this image from the camera on my quad. If I go into the main menu, you can see it looks exactly the same as it did on the Avatar HD goggles or the Fat Shark Dominators. It has all of the same options and settings as we found in the goggles. So for instance, if we go along to the top, you can see we've got the channel settings at the moment 4 because we're in 50 megabits mode. If I come across to the main settings, you can see we've got the headers for the camera, the display, the recording options, as well as the device info. And then we've got all of the other options like we have on the Avatar goggles, whether it be transmitting power, frame rate, high or low. I currently got it in high frame rate because this capture card can record in that. We've got the low battery options, the resolution, the standby mode, the bit rate, the language. Again, exactly the same options as you have on the Avatar HD. And then if we go under each of the sub menus, you've got the camera options, which give you scene, EV, white balance, all of that stuff. If I go back, we've then got the display settings, including the brightness, the output from the module, the custom OSD options, the recording options, so whether you want it to record on the VTX itself, or whether you want it to record on the VRX only, whether you want to format the SD card or the internal storage, and automatically record at takeoff. And then we've got the device info, which shows things such as the serial number. Now, the real important things to note is this setting over here, and this is the frame rate setting, because this will dictate what the output will be from the VRX module. For instance, it's capable of either that 60 frames a second or that 100 frames a second ultra low latency mode like it had on the goggles themselves. The thing to be careful of though is selecting this mode whilst not having a compatible goggle. Not every goggle is going to support this low latency mode. In fact, the only goggle that does today is the HDZero one, and as a result of that, you're going to need to be careful selecting that low latency mode if your goggle doesn't support it. If you were to accidentally select it and your goggle didn't support it, you'd probably get a blank output, and then you're going to have to try and navigate to it yourself manually to be able to find it. If you did need to do this, because I have actually done it myself, you will need to make sure that your quad is turned on and connected to the VRX module, because you can't navigate and change that option without the quad being connected. If it is, you then go into the menu, you then need to go down, 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 hit the button, change the option, hit the button again, and that way it should kick in. I have personally done it and managed to successfully do it. So if you do change it accidentally, there is an out and you can manually change it back. So my first set of testing with the VRX module is going to be on the Skyzone 04Xs. Now, these goggles only support the standard latency mode. They do not support the low latency mode. And whilst I would have liked to have tried the low latency mode, I can't do it today. And we're going to be testing it against another quad, which is my DJI system, just to have a feel of how they compare. Okay, so first flight with the VRX module. And let's take it out for a spin. Now what we're just going to do is just to have an understanding of how this performs and feels compared to the goggles. Now I'm using this on the Skyzone 04Xs at the moment. That's the goggles I'm using. I can't use my HDZeros a minute because of an unforeseen issue, so I'm trying it with the Skyzone 04Xs. Now obviously, as a result of using the 04Xs, we don't have that low latency mode. We're having to use that normal latency mode, which is the higher latency. I'll be honest, so far, I'm not feeling any issues. It's what I would expect the latency to be on this mode. I'm certainly not noticing anything dramatic, anything that I would say is causing me issues. And the nice thing about testing it in this mode is that I'm getting a representation of the worst case scenario rather than the best case scenario. So we're sort of getting an understanding of, you know, from here, it's not going to get any worse, it's only going to get better. And certainly everything feels really as I would expect it to. Now, to talk about image quality, I was going to head down there a second then, but we'll just go this way a little bit. Image quality wise, it looks fantastic. I'll be honest, on the Skyzone OLEDs, it looks fine. Just a bit darker, actually, I think. No, actually, that's probably Avatar. Avatar does generally look darker in general than the other FPV systems. Just coming over here just to see how it looks behind here. Oh, I'm getting a bit of breakup. Again, I'm behind the other side of those bushes there. Okay, it's winter, so we don't have the same levels of foliage that we would usually have. Compression-wise, it looks the same. What I will do in a minute is hop over to the other goggles. Ooh, got a bit of stutter then on the image. I don't know if you saw that. You're still getting that blanket compression, which we see on the image. But I am seeing it a bit blockier there. Now, I don't know if that's as a result of the HDMI or simply the firmware. But yeah, overall, I have to say, I think it's a real decent option. Let's just slow down a second and just see how things look at a standstill. You can see that grass there. You can certainly see those compression artifacts at that point there. You can see it there. Okay, so flight number 2. And again, just now gonna take it up a little bit higher this time and just sort of observe how it looks more than anything. Just an overview of how this looks compared to what we've seen before. Again, it really does look like the Avatar system, exactly the same, I'll be honest with you. Just, yeah, you know, look, we're not in low latency mode, so obviously there is going to be an effect as a result of that, but I don't feel it's any more than I'm used to seeing. Yeah, you know, I just, yeah, you know, just trying to, just on the sticks, yeah, it just feels fine. It really does just feel fine. Now, obviously, there's always going to be questions of the performance of the module with regards to range and penetration compared to the goggles, and that's really hard to test, because at the end of the day it's heavily based on the antennas. I do know at this location what the system performs like, and I'm getting roughly what I would expect. I'll just slow it down here. You know, look, I am below that level there. Just if I go down towards this corner, this is the part where we usually start to get the system play up. You can see it is still very dark in the shadows. I haven't jacked up the camera settings here, but look, overall it's working very, very well. It really is, considering I'm behind this, and this is all on stock antennas as well. So again, really no, and you can then see it clear up nicely. I'll be honest, no major issues or concerns at all. It just feels good. Okay, so it's now time to test them with these, the HDZero goggles. Now, the reason the HDZero goggles differ to the others is because these support the low latency mode via the HDMI input. Today, these are the only goggles that support that full 100 frames a second via HDMI, and that's going to allow you to put the Avatar HD system into the low latency mode, just like we see on the original goggles. Now, I've got them on the 100 frames a second mode, so we're going straight for the low latency, and what we're going to do now is do a few more tests just to see if I can feel a difference between the two modes on these goggles. Right, let's get it going and take off. Now, as I've said, this is the 120 frames a second mode, so this is as good as it's going to get. This is how the performance is as close as it can be to the original Avatar goggles, and we're going to get that best possible low latency. It might not be quite as low as we get on the usual Avatar system. I'm just doing some moving around just to see how it feels. Oh, I'm getting a low battery warning on my goggles battery, so please do ignore the beep if you can hear it. I'll swap it on the next pack. Overall, I have to say again, the image quality looks fine. Let's just take it now down here. The head round. It certainly doesn't feel like I'm really noticing any major latency spikes compared to what I would feel on the Avatar goggles. Really, here we're on the field, so we really shouldn't see anything untoward. Obviously, with both the receiver and the goggles being powered off this battery, it is having an effect, and that's what we're now hearing on the beeping. It's going to be annoying for you, I know. Just coming behind here just to see how it feels. Overall, yeah, the latency spikes don't seem to be jumping up too much. Everything really does feel as I would expect it to feel when flying with the Avatar goggles normally. Just going behind here. Yeah, everything really is absolutely fine. Okay, so we're in that low latency mode, this time with the HDZero goggles again, so let's go. Let's see how it feels. Everything feels fairly decent so far.
overall it's not the lowest system in the world, and it still is not remotely like HDZero, but it certainly isn't terrible. And just looking at the overall behavior of the signal, let's take it over here and just see how it tends to behave in the areas where I do usually start to lose signal. We can see the megabytes have dropped, but it's holding up pretty well. It really is, considering we are the other side of those bushes and we are a bit lower, if I'm honest. Now obviously you can see that the camera is very dark again. Let's take it out of there. I think the internal patches are decent enough. I'm not particularly seeing anything with the antennas that I'm concerned about, put it that way. I'm not going to tell you they're the best in the world, but they're certainly not the worst. Pushing it through as much as I can. I believe we are clear there, I'm being told. So we can see the signal is a little bit low. But coming back through. All looks fine. Oh. Again, we had a few bushes there, but we could see them. Overall, I think it performs great. I've really got no complaints at all. So, yeah, it's fine. Absolutely fine. Just doing what I'd expect it to do. It's not the best weather today for testing, and I'm certainly not going to be doing any long range stuff. More than anything, this was just a feel for how the system behaves, how it performs, especially on the sticks as well. And really, I think you're getting very comparable performance here to the Avatar goggles when using it with HDZero. What I will say is I'm not seeing that tearing now in this 100 frames a second mode on these goggles, at least. It all looks fine. It's something I want to do a bit more testing with, but overall, all looking good.
Okay, so to share with you my thoughts on the Avatar HD VRX module. Now, before I do that, I just want to say they did send me this module for free. However, they've not seen this video before it's been published. And as always, my thoughts are entirely my own. So, what do I think? Well, actually, I think it's very good. It is obviously going to add some latency compared to the Avatar HD goggles because you're having to have a HDMI layer in between your goggles and the VRX. We have that additional chip now, which is doing the conversion from DisplayPort to HDMI, and your goggles are going to have its frame buffer, and there will be latency in that part of the system. It is going to vary depending on what goggles you use as well. It really isn't down to the VRX module that's going to cause the biggest difference in latency. It's going to be down to the goggles and how some goggles cache the image, how some goggles push that onto the display buffer. Now, I'm not going to cover latency too much in this video. Chris Rosser has done a huge amount of testing on this. I'd suggest checking it out. What I'm going to do though is give you an opinion on latency, having spent time flying it. In the 60 frames a second mode, I can't really feel a difference between this and the Avatar goggles. There might be a little, but overall it's very similar. Get this on the HDZero goggles on that 100 frames a second, and I think it's very comparable to the Avatar goggles. I don't think you are giving up a lot. Now, as I've said already, I don't know what the options are going to be moving forward with goggles to be able to support this module fully, but today the only goggles that do support them fully are the HDZero ones, which do work with both that 60 frames a second and 100 frames a second modes. If you're using any other goggle, you're going to be limited to that normal latency 60 frames a second mode, and as a result of that, you do need to be aware that it will have that higher latency figure. I think Caddx, or Walksnail I should say, have done a really decent job on this module. They've brought the ability to add digital FPV like HDZero did with their module to cheaper low-end goggles with a HDMI input, or allow people with different goggles that might not want to use this system as their main system the ability to bolt it on. So for instance, if you're a HDZero user, you can simply bolt this on when you want to use it if you're after this kind of digital FPV system. Now, as for how this module works and behaves on these two different sets of goggles, image quality wise, it's fantastic on both. They are both high-end OLEDs, the O4X and the HDZeros, so they should look good, and I'll be honest, the image quality does not disappoint. It is as good, in my opinion, as it is on the Avatar system. There is, though, differences between the two. Obviously, as I've mentioned several times, the latency, these can only do the 60 frames a second, whereas these can do the 100. I did notice some tearing on the image on the Skyzones, as I mentioned in the video. Not dramatic, but I could spot it. It's not something I've seen on the HDZeros, and it is something I want to continue to investigate. It isn't dramatic, and it may simply be as a result of that 60 frames a second mode, but I would have thought I'd have seen it on these as well. It's something I want to investigate further. Maybe it's something we could see improved in the future with firmware. It certainly isn't a deal breaker. It was very, very minor. I could see it. Very similar to what you see in gamings when you don't have the synchronization on the monitor. Now, as I did mention, there is obviously the latency difference, but really, when you're comparing them like for like in 60 frames a second, it's exactly the same. As for powering and fitting the module onto the goggles, it's pretty straightforward. If you're going to mount it on the Skyzones, you can use the HDZero bracket exactly the same as you could on their VRX module. You can 3D print this up, and this then will clip over that fan mount on the top there, holding it in place. There's also some real nice bracket options for the HDZero goggles. I've got these 3D printed brackets that allow you to clip the module on to the rail system on the front, and it simply goes on like that. And then if you want to remove it, you can just simply lift it and it comes off nicely and easily. There is also other brackets out there that allow you to leave your patch antennas on and clip this on the front. It does add weight to the goggles, and it does get heavy when you do start looking at the HDZero goggles, because these are not the lightest goggle on the market today anyway. And when you add this module on the front, it is putting a bit more weight on the front of the nose. However, it wasn't terrible for me. It didn't cause me any discomfort, but I could feel that there was quite a lot of weight, especially when I just had the goggles on my head moving around. The Skyzones are lighter in themselves, therefore, even with the module on board, there's going to be less weight, but it isn't dramatic overall what the difference is between them. But it is something I did want to mention simply because I did notice it whilst out in the field. Now, talking about the antennas, I do want to touch a bit on them because there has been a lot of talk about the quality of the antennas on this module. In my tests, as you can see from some of the S11 results, the numbers aren't great. However, in my real world testing, it wasn't terrible. It's losing signal in the same places I lose signal with the other antennas on the goggles, such as the True RCs, and it isn't really dropping out any quicker. I'd say there is a little bit of loss on performance with these antennas, but I can't say you need to run out and spend another $50, $60 on a set. My advice to you would be trying the antennas for yourself, and only if you're having problems to swap them out. I'm not going to tell you they're the best, but they're certainly not junk, and I was having no problems in my testing with them whatsoever. As for the overall quality of the module, it's okay. It's quite large, but that was to be expected. The plastics do feel a bit cheap, but at the end of the day, what counts is how it performs. And I have to say, overall, I think it does a very good job. I've got no major concerns. And if you're someone who is looking to get into digital FPV and is looking at the Avatar system, if you've got a set of goggles with HDMI in, I would seriously consider checking this out. It's a cheaper way of getting involved, about $200, and that way you can dip your toe in without having to spend $500-$600 on a set of goggles. And then if you do like it, you can then consider what your options are. For instance, you could go and get the Avatar HD goggles, or you could get yourself a set of HDZero goggles, which not only do support that low latency mode, but support HDZero, analog, and are going to give you far more options than you can get from any other goggle on the market today. Now, that is pretty much it for me on this module. As I've said, I really have very few complaints, and I think it's great to see the guys over at Caddx / Walksnail continue to develop the system. We haven't really seen many firmware updates for the Avatar system in general in the last few months. They have been pushing things forward, but there are still some things that need to be resolved, and those things are the same on this module as they are on the goggles. That be focus mode and the companion or ride along or spectator mode, whichever we want to call it. Those features are still not there today. However, hopefully we will see updates from them in the future. In the end, I think it's a good option. I don't think the latency is a major problem for most pilots. If you're into racing, obviously it's going to be completely different to HDZero, but what I can't say is it's dramatically more than you would see on the Avatar HD goggles, and that's a good thing. So if you're looking to give it a try, I see no reason to do it. Now, if you have found this video interesting, please do let me know what you think in the comment section. If you've got any questions, please do put them in there as well. I also want to say, if you want to support the channel to allow us to keep making content like this, please do consider checking out the links to my Patreon. It's only through the support of Patreon am I able to keep making content like this. I want to say a massive thank you to all of my patrons for the support, and if you want to help us continue to make content on the channel, please do consider checking it out. Anyway, that's it from me. Stay safe. I'll speak to you soon.